The cerebral cortex is a part of the brain which is a thin layer folded up around the periphery. It is around 2 to 5 millimeters thick, and if folded out would be about the size of a napkin. Within it there is 4 major lobes: the occipital lobe, in charge of vision and visual association; the temporal lobe, which is in charge of many senses, including auditory and hearing and auditory, and a little bit of smell, also some hearing and auditory memory. In addition, the parietal lobe is in charge of most visual and some speech and taste, and a couple of other senses. And then the frontal cortex is in charge of 90% of the things, actually. It's in charge of almost every sense, and it's also in charge of motor control. So I will be focusing on one part of the frontal lobe, which is a part of the cerebral cortex called the primary motor cortex, and I will also be going over a few other cortices.
Motor cortex is a region of cortex in the frontal lobe that is involved with voluntary movement. It is located anterior to a large sulcus called the central sulcus, and is often divided into two major regions: the primary motor cortex and the non-primary motor cortex. The primary motor cortex is found in the strip of cortex known as the precentral gyrus, which is located just anterior to the central sulcus. The primary motor cortex is arranged such that different parts of the region are associated with motor control of different parts of the body, and thus is said to contain a motor map of the body.
These motor maps are called homunculuses. Homunculuses not only show where in the brain the sense is coming from often, it also shows how prevalent a sense is in the amount of neurons involved, that by showing the size.
Most of the neurons that travel from the primary motor cortex carrying signals regarding movement will enter one of two major motor pathways: the corticospinal or corticobulbar tracts. The corticospinal tract carries movement-related signals to the spinal cord to cause movement of the body, while the corticobulbar tract carries signals to the brainstem to cause movement of the head, neck, and face. The non-primary motor cortex is often divided into two main regions: the supplementary motor cortex and the premotor cortex. Although the functions of these areas are not well understood, it is thought the supplementary motor cortex may be involved with the execution of sequences of movement, the attainment of motor skills, and the selection of movements based on incoming sensory information. The premotor cortex contributes about 30% of the neurons that enter the corticospinal tract, but seems to be more active during the planning of, rather than the execution of, movements.
Now we will be going into more depth on how we get from the brain to the nervous system.
The nerve impulses pass from the cortex and travel into the brainstem along bundles of nerve fibers which cross in the medulla oblongata. Impulses from the right side of the brain thus control the left side of the body, and vice versa. The nerve impulses then pass from the medulla oblongata to fibers in the spinal cord, and leave at each section as the motor routes to form the spinal nerves, which transmit the impulses to the muscles. Involuntary muscle movements are controlled by the autonomic nerves, which leave the motor route and then pass to nearby nerve chains.
The first step is that an action potential, also known as an electrical charge, travels down a motor neuron. It runs into the skeletal muscle at the skeletal end plate through a chemical synapse. On the other side of that are the axon terminals of the motor neurons. There are 7 steps involved in the process of triggering a muscle to actually then be stimulated from the motor neuron. The first step is that an action potential travels down the axon into an axon terminal. Then it opens up the voltage-gated calcium channels, and that actually allows for it to flow in and then open acetylcholine sacs, basically, via exocytosis. The acetylcholine sacs are also called synaptic vesicles. The acetylcholine now diffuses and binds to acetylcholine receptors on something called a ligand-gated cation channel. That channel then opens and allows the sodium to go in from the synaptic cleft, which is the space between the skeletal muscle and the axon terminal, and potassium molecules to go out. That actually creates a membrane potential, and that membrane potential actually triggers action potential to go through the neuron, to go through the muscle, and that is actually what triggers the muscle to twitch in this case. And how actually the process stops is when all of the acetylcholine is off the receptors, and that can happen in a couple of ways. The two ways it can happen are either it diffuses away from the receptors because of lack of it in other areas, or it actually ends up having acetylcholinesterase, which is a molecule, come and separate into choline and acetyl acid. So those are the two ways that the process can end. That choline and acetyl acid is then recycled back into the axon terminal to be used again later. Another important part of the human motor system is myelin sheaths. The reason why myelin sheaths are needed is they help protect the signal by insulating it. The reason that is needed is because it will help the signal to go faster and not die off, allowing you to react quicker and to actually react. The way it does that is, in a simple version, it basically allows the electrical signal to, instead of going straight through the axon the entire time, it allows it to jump from over myelin sheath to myelin sheath. The way a myelin sheath is built is, at least for Schwann cells, which are those of the periphery nervous system, it's just a roll of fat, basically, layered and layered, with a nucleus on the outside, and that actually is enough to allow this signal to be sustained. It only takes up it's only wrapped around, there's actually multiple wrapped around one axon for neuron, except for in the brainstem and the brain, oligodendrocytes are actually wrapped around generally more than one neuron. So that's a brief deep dive into the motor control system and a little bit of the nervous system too. Hope you enjoyed.